Welcome to the How to Be Awesome at Your Job podcast, the show where brilliant professionals share how to sharpen the universal skills required to flourish at work. Enjoy more career fun, wins, meaning, and money with your host, Pete Makaitis.
Hello and welcome to episode 833 with Andres Lares. Andres has some outstanding wisdom when it comes to how our decisions really made and thusly how can we influence folks well. So you'll learn 1, how to tap into the hidden driver behind most decisions. 2, the critical steps that set you up for greater influence. And 3, what to say when you're losing the other person. So if you want to check out the show notes or the transcript or the links to items that we've referenced, please visit us over at awesomeatyourjob.com/EP833 and see some of our other goodies like the Gold Nugget email list, which summarizes the actionable wisdom from Andres and everybody else on demand. That's the Gold Nuggets at awesomeatyourjob.com. Now, here's a little bit about Andres. Andres Lares has been the managing partner and CEO of Shapiro Negotiations Institute since 2017. Prior to this role, Andres served various roles, including Chief Innovation Officer, where he led the company's professional development of technology and content. For over a decade, Andres has advised professional sports teams in the NBA, NFL, MLB, and NHL on contract negotiations, trades, and other critical negotiations. He has been featured in publications including HBR, Forbes, CNBC, Entrepreneur, and Sports Business Journal. Andres guest lectures at conferences and institutions around the world and teaches a course on negotiations at Johns Hopkins University. Now, here's Andres. Andres, welcome to How to Be Awesome at Your Job.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm so excited to hear your insights on persuasion. Could you kick us off with a particularly striking, fascinating, mind-blowing, counterintuitive discovery you've made in this domain? No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure, huh? So, this is like, if I give this up and there's no really reason to listen to the rest of the podcast.
Keep it short.
But exactly. So, I mean, we can, people will be done in 1 minute. And so there is one thing that really struck me. So when we got into this, so I've been doing this for about 12 years now. And pretty early on, the thing that struck me and sticks with me is essentially kind of a quote that we use in our trainings that has been around really since Aristotle. He was teaching this many years ago, and perhaps not enough people listen. But it's that people make decisions emotionally, and then they justify them rationally.
Mm-hmm.
And that has really stuck with me. We have done an enormous amount of research that indicates that is definitely the case all over the world, regardless of culture and language and everything else. But so that really has stuck with me. So that's it. We're done. We can pack up and go.
Well, I really want to dig into that. So I've heard that, and that seems sensible. Can you unpack that with some of your research and some examples of what that really sounds like in the internal dialogue and practice?
Yeah. And so where does it come from? And what it comes from is heuristics, all the shortcuts in our brain that we take because we have to, right? And so there's a lot of this is covered in one of the books that I've enjoyed and has impacted me the most ever is Thinking Fast and Slow. And no surprise, it's a Nobel Prize winner that wrote it, but another that would have won one if he was around. But it is one of those things that because we have so much that we have to compute in our brains in a short period of time, we really essentially are struggling and taking as many shortcuts as we can. So what does that look like? So I'll give you an example that we often talk about. So this was a study done many years ago. And actually, you know what? There's a couple. So the best one, I'll shift gears here and convince myself of another one. So here's a perfect example of a shortcut and how emotions drive things. So many years ago, there was a study done at Harvard, and it was at a library, or essentially what folks didn't realize what was going on. But it was a study that people were in a copy machine aligned to the copy machine. So again, just the context here, aligned to the copy machine, you really are doing nothing else but making copies. Well, in this study, they basically had actors approach real people and ask 3 different ways in order to button a line. So the first was, can I go in front of you? And so that was it. That was the first thing they asked. The second one, they said, can I go in front of you because I'm in a hurry? And the third one, they said, can I go in front of you because I'm in a hurry? I need to make a lot of copies. Right? So that's the 3. So you're asking someone. So now the percentages here will really tell you how long ago this was. I don't think they would stand up to time. But in the first example, basically just asking to go in front of you, 60% of people approved.
Oh, that's so nice of them.
I know. And so that's how I know this was done, not done recently. In the second, they literally said, because I need to make copies. And 93% of people let him in front. And then when there's a kind of a reason that was a little bit more reasonable, which would be the fact that I need to make a lot of copies in addition to I'm in a hurry, it went up only to 94%.
Mm-hmm.
So what's happening there, right? Just simply the word because and someone sharing a reason with you is enough. It's compelling enough for your brain to think, oh yeah, there's probably a good reason and go. Even the actual reason itself rarely even matters that much. Now, you can't always do this, and there's different circumstances will provide different results. But similar studies have been done all over the place and with adjustments of all types. And there's always that aspect where our brain is taking that shortcut, and it almost doesn't matter what comes after the word because. I hear because, there must be a reason, it must be good, go ahead. And so that is an example, and there's millions of them where people make emotional decisions. And I'll give you one more that I particularly enjoy. It's been done with jelly beans or things like that. You imagine this big jelly bean, one of those where if you pick the number of jelly beans in a container, you get a prize. Imagine that.
Mm-hmm.
And so they said, okay, you have a choice. In this one, there's 10 jelly beans and one is red. And if you pick the red one, so 1 in 10 chance, you will win $100. In another one, they say, look, in this case, there's 100 jelly beans. 8 of them are red. If you pick a red one, you'll get $100. Which would you choose? Now, most people, more than 50%, again, all over the world, will choose the second. Now, why do they choose the second? The first one has a 10% chance. The second one has an 8% chance. 8 out of 100 versus 1 out of 10. But what happens is, well, one is a denominator issue where the math maybe gets a little bit more complicated for folks in the moment. But the second is, emotionally, they feel like they have 8 cracks of that red jelly bean to make the money rather than the one crack. And so that feels more important than the denominator, how many jelly beans there are. And so we pick it. So those are 2 very different examples of that at play.
All right. So now I'm thinking about counterexamples just to put this to the test.
Yep.
I think I've often been in a situation where I do exactly that. I want something or I don't want something. I just like something. I don't like something. And then I find a way just to rationalize it afterwards. Sometimes what's interesting is like I find that I fail. Like I for example, when I saw, it took me a long time with the iPad. I said, okay, I've had some good experiences with Apple products, the iPhone, the iMac, the MacBook Pro, like all 3 of them. I really see their place in my life. But for the longest time, the iPad is just like, I don't see how I need this. I have got a laptop which can do just about all of those things and more. And so I think I went for years without an iPad. Friends, roommates, others had iPads, loved them. And I kept looking at it thinking I wanted it, but it just didn't click for the longest of times. I guess I was not able to marshal the logical reasons until I had just enough experiences of being on a plane and not being able to open up my laptop all the way to actually be able to view it and sit it on the thing because I'm a tall guy and try to get a comfortable angle. And then I thought, well, okay. And then I think there were some lower priced options. It's like, I don't need the newest one. And I got a birthday coming up. So the things all kind of aligned. But I found that intriguing that, and you tell me, am I abnormal or is there a certain threshold that has to be met here? Is that I can have desire, but be unable to bring enough logical justification, even though I'm so good, I think, at rationalizing and justifying a lot of things in order to get me to do the thing that I want or don't want. What's going on in the second layer here?
So when I hear that story, my first reaction is it was the emotion that drove you, right? So what I hear in that story was it wasn't until I was cramped like this in an airplane where I was thinking, what am I doing here? I'm on this 4-hour flight across the country and I can't do anything. It's frustrating whether, you want to watch Netflix and just relax or you want to get some work done. And that's the moment where kind of how you felt in that moment was the true compelling emotion that you get the iPad, right? That's kind of, in my opinion, that's part of what happened there because that's really what drives it. And then you can justify, okay, well, iPad is the best because I'm an Apple user and it's going to sync in very well or whatever. Then the logic will kick in and work through all the details. But that first desire or that shift from desire to actually doing it, I think that probably happened on an airplane where you just said, enough is enough. I need this thing.
That is interesting. I guess I thought when the iPad was first unveiled, I had some desire, like, ooh, that looks cool and shiny. I like it. I want it. I was like, but I don't really need it. Where does it fit into anything? So I guess maybe in your model, what's happening here is I have insufficient desire, or until I had a new emotional experience of I'm very uncomfortable in the seat and want to have more comfort in the seat.
So it's interesting because I think that is a non-money version of what we often see, which is that folks will want, so if there's something that you want, that's got some strength. But avoiding something you don't want has even more strength. And that happens with money, right? So if you say someone $100 for sure versus 50% chance to win 200 or zero, most people will pick 100. Because what happens is if they miss out, and then it happens even more strongly if it's a loss. And so I think what's happening there is the fact that, hey, this thing's shiny, I really want this thing, that's compelling. But the level of how compelling it is when you actually then faced a negative emotion, like this is really frustrating, and I could get rid of this frustration if I bought a tablet, and that tablet happens to be an iPad. I think that's the one that's going to be more compelling, which is why that happened. And so when it's nice and shiny, that's compelling, but it's typically not as powerful as the other.
Mm-hmm. And then I'm curious about business to business type decisions. Like, I think in a way, at least if you are a director at a publicly traded corporation, for example, you have a legal obligation to look out for the shareholders' best interests. Mm-hmm. And so it seems like there are some solutions that it's like, oh, this should produce ROI. So in some ways, like, we're really supposed to, quote unquote, think extra super duper logically about the financial logical consequences of a thing. Are emotions still running the show here too?
So yes, but I think there's some things that remove some of that, right? So for example, if you've got a decision that takes a long time, so the longer you put something through a decision-making process and the more people involved, although groupthink does happen, but more people, more time, there's a bunch of these variables that will do that, right? So in the moment, if you think about, let's move to a totally different world. Let's go to a grocery store, right? And that's another example. In the grocery store, why is it that there's gum and snacks while you wait to pay, right? So if you put, those gum and snacks are also in another aisle, but they're bought significantly less. But in that moment where you're just waiting and you're sitting around, and it's going to take 3 more minutes which feels like 15 when you're waiting for the next person to pay, you make this kind of emotional decision of like, oh yeah, this is what I need, right? And so what happens is, I think that's kind of taking advantage of that. Now, over time, if you saw that in the aisle, you wouldn't have got that piece of gum, or you wouldn't have gotten that candy bar. And the same thing would occur with corporate decisions, right? If you're a director at a company, if you make a decision over a couple of weeks, it's less and less emotional. Now, emotions still play. I remember kind of finding this stat, which still shocks me to this day, that the first and last, as far as like those two, typically in an RFP type process where it's a little bit informal, or in an fully informal kind of bidding process, the first and last are selected more than 50% of the time.
Wow.
Even when there's more than 4 or 5 vendors. So it's imbalanced in the first and last. And again, that's another way we're emotional beings. And the first sets the tone. The last is the one we're most likely to remember. And so if the first sets the tone and others don't necessarily stack up to it, or they say some things that are unique, or the last does something that's impressive in any way, they'll last with us, and that you pick them. And it's unbelievable that you may not be picking the best partner for your company. You're literally picking who went first or last, potentially. And even worse, we don't know it. Even if we do know it, we often can't do anything about it. Now, of course, there are ways. So writing things down, decision-making processes, taking time to digest and think through it, creating a criteria, there's things you can do, but it is amazing how emotional we are as beings.
Well, that is so shocking and striking. I almost feel the need to construct a counter narrative that explains it, such as, well, the first person, they really got their act together. They got some hustle. That is a high performing organization that moves quickly, and that's an advantage. So they deserve stuff. And the last folks, boy, they really put some thought into this. They took their time. They did their research and their homework and their preparation. And so the first and the last may disproportionately, in fact, be superior potential partners. I might be stretching here, but that's where I come to go.
Yeah, in the cases where there's no choice, I think we see it happen too. But it happens, just about everywhere. So another one is called the winner's curse often. So if you think of like a bidding system, typically the person, and this happens in sports, we do a lot of work in sports. And if you think of an athlete that goes to a team, oftentimes, and this happens in baseball, perhaps more than any other sport, it's okay. You're willing to pay $10 million a year for 10 years. I'm willing to pay more, and you're willing to pay more. And then you go back and forth, and then finally the person that wins is essentially cursed because they win by definition by overpaying for that player.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, that's typically emotional. When we've been in the trenches with teams, that is because they get caught up in the deal making or because it is a blurriness. It is an emotional piece because I would say 99.9% of the time when we meet with the teams and we're kind of involved in these kind of decisions, they have written down a number as a walk away that's lower than they end up paying. So they end up going well above what they said they would, what they think is reasonable. And so that is where the justification comes in. I am going over, but things have changed, fill in the blank. Now, of course, there are times where things have actually changed. The market is, maybe you start a negotiation early in free agency and 5 other players get signed and now the market's moved up. That, of course, is a possibility. But very rarely is that the reason that's happening. It's deal fever. We're in it. We spent so much time. And there's a sunk cost fallacy, right? If I've spent this much time on it, it's only this much more. And that's where the justification comes in. And really, it becomes more emotional rather than if you were objective, you'd say, look, the max I was going to pay this player was 10 years, $10 million a year. And it's better for me not to do that than it is to pay more. We just very rarely come across that.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Andres, we're having so much fun jumping all around the psychological world here. Maybe let's get to the fundamentals here. Your book, Persuade, the 4-step process to influence people and decisions. We've already got some tasty tidbits from it, but what would you say is the core message, thesis, big idea of this one?
It's a 4-step process to influencing others.
All right. Just like you said.
Exactly. That's it. Build credibility, engage emotion, demonstrate logic, facilitate action. So really it's building credibility. People will not care if they're not deemed credible. Think of a toothpaste commercial, right? Every toothpaste commercial has someone who either is or looks like a dentist. That's because they don't have credibility without the dental looking attire. And so that is, that's an example of a crude one, but it is an example. Then engage emotion. As I talked about, people make decisions emotionally and then they justify them rationally. Then comes demonstrate logic. Now, of course, there is a time and a place for logic. So it isn't that you just never do it. It's that you typically and most compellingly do it after you've built credibility and engaged emotion. And then finally, the 4th is facilitate action, which is if you can think of all the situations where you say, is this a good idea? And your teammate says yes, your colleague says yes. Okay, are we going to move forward? Yes, we are. And then all of a sudden you check in 2 weeks later and nothing has happened. I think just about everyone can relate to that. And so facilitate action is about creating an environment where it's as likely as possible that the behavior that you want to be taken will be taken.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, sounds good to me. Lay it on us then. Let's say we want to do some great persuading.
Yep.
Can you maybe give us some example demonstrations for how you'd step through each of these pieces, from building the credibility to engaging the emotion to demonstrating logic and to facilitating action?
Yeah. So just let's try to pick something that potentially anyone can relate to. So you're working with a colleague at work. So potentially, let's say they're not necessarily someone above you or below you. They're kind of a lateral position. And so hopefully this is generic enough that it works for everyone. So the first thing is you want to think about, okay, do I have credibility with this person? I'm trying to convince Pete to do something. Okay, so how am I going to do it? Well, first is, does Pete know who I am? Does he think that I've got good ideas? What is this perception of me? And so let's assume that it's a neutral perception, met a few times and not much there. So the first I would think about, how do I build credibility? So build credibility might be simple things. So spending time with someone, unless you actively do something very negative, generally spending time with someone helps you to build rapport, trust, and credibility. But also you could give yourself a few things. So when you bump into Pete and there's an opportunity to say, hey, I thought of you the other day. When I read this article, I'll send it to you by end of day tomorrow. That'd be an example of manufacturing an opportunity where you, in this case, you should genuinely have thought about the person and think that that article might make sense. But then I sent it to Pete in the timeline that I said I would. Well, now you're starting to create not only that connection based on thinking of the person, but also a sense of reliability. I said I would do something by end of day tomorrow, and I did. So you can do a few of those things and you start to get the ball rolling. And of course, anytime you provide value, right, good ideas, things they can implement at work, anything that is important and valuable to the other party would help build credibility.
Mm-hmm.
So then comes emotion. So let's say in this case, you're working on a project together. And again, to pick an example that most people could relate to, Pete has this as priority 7, and I have this as priority 2. And so my job is to convince you to bring it up to maybe not 2, but certainly higher than 7. Well, then you think of, okay, what's the emotion I want to trigger? So let's pick 2 examples. So one might be achievement. Pete, this is one of the reasons I asked you in particular to kind of be involved in this project, is because I know that this is going to get a lot of attention from the senior leadership team. It's a really important project. So if we were to do this was done very well. And again, has to be true. This is genuine. If it's disingenuous, then please don't use the model. But if you go back to that, okay, so if that's the case, then there's a sense of achievement. Doing a good job in this, and that includes timely, but also high quality, a sense of achievement that it'll be better for everyone, right? And so that could be an example. And another one could be fear, the other way. I'm a little bit worried, Pete, that we're a little behind schedule. Being behind schedule right now is not a big deal, but if we were to end up being late, I think this could be a disaster for both of us. I saw one of our other colleagues late 2 months ago on a similar project, and they ended up getting fill in the blank, right, as whatever the repercussion would be. So that'd be an example of fear or achievement. There's a lot of them. Then the next would be demonstrating logic, right? So there, what is the logic you could say? So one of the things that I've found is because we're currently meeting once every 2 weeks, we're forgetting by the time we actually get to the next meeting, we're forgetting what we covered. So I think if we, rather than doing once every 2 weeks, and this would take 8 weeks to get these meetings, if we were to meet a couple of times in 1 week, I actually think we could pump it out faster. So rather than our estimation of 20 hours total, we could probably do it in 10 or 15. Would you be open to considering something like that, and we just get it done faster for both our sakes? So something like that would be a logically compelling argument that, hey, I'm going to save you time and more efficient and get this off your plate faster so you can get to other priorities. And then finally, facilitate action might be to provide them with options. So providing with options could say, so 2 ideas that I have are, 1, do you want me to do this piece and you do that piece? Or would you prefer the other way around? I focus on this part, you focus on that part. What would you prefer? And you would ideally be offering a set of options, and you might throw in a third, that you're willing to accept any of them. So they're all acceptable to you, but that way the person feels like, and do in fact have some control over the result. Because we certainly know that when you come up with a collaborative solution, they're more likely to be committed than rather than if I say, hey, Pete, here's what I need you to do, and here's what I need it done by, please go and execute and come back to me when you're done. Mm-hmm. So that would be a bit of a generic example, but hopefully it gives you some sense of how those 4 phases would come into play.
I appreciate that. Yes. Well, now could you maybe give us a couple of top do's and don'ts within each of those domains? So when it comes to building credibility, for example, what are some great things we can do versus not do? In your book, you've got a few sections, the influencer's toolbox. I love toolboxes. So if there's anything that's leaping to mind that's extra handy, lay it on us.
Yeah. So do's and don'ts. So for credibility, some of the don't is do not skip this step. This is potentially the most important step. If you think of kind of your life right now and how much you get bombarded with messaging, whether it's emails at work or calls and spam calls and your fam, all the stuff that's going on, it's easier to just ignore something than it is to deal with it. Mm-hmm. So credibility is the thing that stops you from ignoring it, right? It's what cuts through and it helps to cut through the clutter, if you will. And so I think I see this a lot in, we'll take away a little bit from kind of the job piece, and I'll go to sales for a second. This is a perfect example in sales. Often those people rush through to get the sale, and they skip the personal, the credibility building, the trust building. They get right to the sale. And so what happens is, well, you've missed that first part that even allows you to get there, right? And so people just don't care, right? You're just selling me something, and I don't want to be sold to. I want to be part of the buying process. So the credibility piece is don't skip it. It can be easy, and oftentimes you wonder, how important is this? Well, it's really important. For emotion, as far as do's and don'ts, so it's got to be, I think the don't, again, would be, it has to be genuine. And so really the emotion is about thinking about, okay, what is, so here, for example, fear, and when people hear fear and scarcity, I'll give you an example of a don't would be, although it can work, it's sleazy and doesn't work long-term. That's why you see, in at commercials late at night, this deal is only good for the next 15 minutes. If you call now, you get 3 easy payments rather than 4 easy payments, right? And so it's that concept. Now, the thing is, most of us are smart enough to know that once this commercial ends, this commercial will run again tomorrow night, and the next night, and the next night. It's a fake exploding deadline. And so I think there, when you think of fear, when you're thinking of, scarcity, any of those things, especially that are negative, it's got to be genuine, right? In that example I gave of the consequence, it has to be a real consequence that actually you saw someone face, because your credibility will be lost if it's made up. And so It's a don't again in emotion. And then for logic, I think do tell stories. The best way to communicate evidence, logic, data, oftentimes we want to do in this big chart and graph, and that is helpful and supportive for visual learners. But then take the extra step to tell a compelling story of how that potentially helped another client or why you should get a raise or whatever it is. But if you can tell a short and compelling story to communicate the same message as what you could just be sharing in another way, you will be more effective in the former. And then finally, facilitate action. I would say some do's or consider providing options for sure. And then one other thing is consider a safety net. So safety net meaning, and again, I'll go to the crude late night infomercials because they use a lot of psychological warfare on all of us, but it's the money back guarantee. And the concept of that is how many people actually buy that product and then send it back. Very, very, very small number of people in almost all cases. But just the mere fact that if we purchase it and we're not satisfied, we could then send it back. That makes us more comfortable to purchase it in the first place. So an example in business is, certainly sometimes there can be warranties of some sort. That's an example of, in almost any product that's sold in the B2B space or B2C space. But just if you could remove some of the risk for another party, you will make it more likely that they move forward.
Okay, thank you. Well, I also wanted to get your take on some body language pieces. Are there any really reliable cues or indicators that we can feel somewhat confident about when we notice? And what do they mean?
So what I'd like to do is slightly tweak that, if you're okay with this, and say the thing that you can count on is to only make decisions when you're getting a consistent message from the body language.
Okay.
So that's the only thing that's reliable. What do I mean by that? If I cross my arms like this while we're having a conversation, technically that is not the best sign, but on its own, it means nothing. It happens to be particularly cold in this room. And so that could be just literally a physical response to that being cold. But now let's take me crossing my arms like this, turning a little bit away from you. So I'm actually facing another direction. And potentially, let's say I slow down my smiling and now start having facial expressions that are more neutral or potentially negative. Then you can really start to read into that. That's kind of a pattern at that point. And so what you want to see is consistency with the tone, what's being said, and the body language. And if there are more than one, typically 2 or 3, that tend to lean negative, you want to change what you're saying, change the environment, ask a different question, take a different approach, whatever it may be. But I would say, so the do's and don'ts, the do's is look for consistency, look for multiple things that point in the same direction, negative or positive. Lots of smiling, open hands, leaning in would be the positive. Crossing arms, turning away, less smiling would be the negative ones. But you want those to be consistent and multiple if you're going to read anything into it.
Okay. And so in terms of a real-time adjustment we might make, what are some of the options there?
So there's 2 of the most common. One is kind of call it out. Oh, did I say something do you have any questions? Did I say something that maybe was off a little bit? And so in my opinion, lots of people recommend that. I think that can be, it's something that is doable, but that can take a lot of confidence, right? It's almost like calling someone out on it. Oh, no, it can be a little bit. So, but that is something that people do. But generally, I would say is try to ask a question or try to change where your conversation's headed. So I'll give you an example. Potentially, if this were to happen, let's say in an interview, let's say you're in an interview for a job. And so you see that someone's crossed leg, turns away and starts, all of a sudden you see eyebrows change a little bit. It's a little more negative. Then you might, whatever you're saying, you might pause for, or try to finish it kind of rather quickly. And then say, now, Pete, I'd love to tell you more about that, but I did have a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind. Is this a good place I can ask you some? And then say, okay, tell me more about, and fill in the blank of questions you had ready. So you were saying something, or the opposite. If you're asking a lot of questions and the person's kind of doing those negative things together, they may be signaling to you the fact that, you're kind of done asking questions. Now it's my turn. I want to get to know you, and it's been 2 one way. So essentially what you're reading is whatever you're saying or doing in the moment, they're not particularly appreciating. So any pivot from that, and then see how the body language is reacting, right? After another minute or 2, are you still seeing that negative body language? One other thing I would say, and this gets into NLP and things that are a little bit less science-based, or, they're a little bit more controversial, but there definitely is growing evidence that you can do something that is called mirroring, which would be to try to also move towards the body language that is more positive, and they'll kind of follow you.
Mhm.
So, for example, if I notice that you're tilted a little bit this way and you're leaning back a little bit, I would first mirror. So I would tilt a little bit the same way. I would try to speak at the same pace as you are. So whether it's a lot faster and I'm going really, really fast or slower. And then what I would do is over time, over the next few minutes, I would start to kind of tilt my head this way. I would start to lean in. I would start to open my body language. And so what you can do is you can also shift that way. So not only what you're saying and the tone of your delivery, but if you actually mirror their body language, that's potentially negative in particular in this case, and then start to move towards more positive body language, they should follow you.
Okay. Good deal. Thank you. Well, now could you share a favorite quote, something you find inspiring?
I think there's a few that come to mind. So one I particularly like that one of our facilitators often says was, much is lost for the want of asking.
Mm-hmm.
So to remind us that if you don't ask for it, you can't get it. You don't always get what you ask for, but if you don't ask, you don't get it. I think there's another one that often is attributed to Epictetus. I'm not sure if necessarily it was in fact him or not, but it's that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth so we can listen twice as much as we speak. I think that is a good reminder and just the value of listening, asking questions and listening. So I like those. And there's one more. Harry Truman, I believe, is a credit to this, but it's what you learn after you know it all that really counts. And I think that one's brilliant. So those are 3 that come to mind. You asked for 1, I gave you 3. I hope that's okay.
That's good. Thank you. And could you share a favorite study or experiment or bit of research?
Yeah, so I would hate to kind of duplicate, but I'd probably go back to the copier study, the jelly bean study, some of these. Those were the originals when they were done the first time. And I find it particularly interesting that it was done 20, 30, 40 years ago in some of these cases. And so much has changed in the world, but they continue to be, when they're redone and adjusted, they continue to have the same results. So all of those reminding us of human nature and how it often doesn't change.
All right. And could you share a favorite book?
I would go back to probably Thinking Fast and Slow. I mean, I think that's certainly from a nonfiction perspective, that would be my number 1. It's a big read, but really an incredible one.
And a favorite tool, something you used to be awesome at your job?
From the personal side, I've got family all over the world and friends all over the world, so I cannot live without WhatsApp. From a professional side, I mean, any good calendar app. Currently, it's Google Calendar, but that is another one that I can't live without.
All right. And a favorite habit?
It would probably be playing hockey.
All right.
So I play hockey every Monday night. Been doing it for years. Awesome.
Is there a key nugget you share with folks that really resonates with them? They quote back to you often?
So, yeah, I would say one, it's and this is more on the negotiation side than the influencing side, but it's negotiation is a process and not an event.
Okay. If folks want to learn more, get in touch, where'd you point them?
So we're not as active as we should be on social, but we do have, a bunch of LinkedIn, Twitter, all the usuals. But I would say probably the website, shapironegotiations.com. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And we've got a blog that's weekly that goes out there too and deals with job-related issues, plus things that you might do, buying a house, buying a car, lots of B2B stuff as well. That's our focus. So feel free to reach out.
All right. And do you have a final challenge or call to action for folks looking to be awesome at their jobs?
I think for me, it'd be around having a process. I think one of the things that I've appreciated in this journey that I think when we go out and train and coach folks, we often will learn as much as they do just from the way people do it and get other best practices. But I would say the concept of having a process for persuading others, for often negotiation, communicating, has really increased my performance. And I would say it's the thing that I'm so excited about. And so I would say I would challenge others to, when it's easy to say I don't have the time or I'm just going to wing it, to prepare and follow a process to do it. And you will definitely be more successful.
All right. This has been fun. I wish you much luck in all of your persuasions and negotiations.
Well, thank you for having me. I hope it's helpful to folks as they do a great job with their jobs, and hopefully this is helpful there.
But I love so much of what Andres had to say about the emotional piece associated with decisions being driven first by emotions and which we later rationalize. And I'd heard that before, and I thought, well, maybe I'm a different customer. I'm a different special, unique flower. But he set me straight, I think, when we dug into that iPad story, that's really stuck with me. I've thought about it again and again in terms of what's the emotion? And if desire isn't doing it, maybe pain is something that's irritating, frustrating, annoying, that you're sick and tired of, you're angry about. Maybe that's what's going on there. Again, the show notes, the transcripts, the links as we've referenced are at awesomeatyourjob.com/EP833. Hope to catch you next time, and peace.
Thanks for listening. To get the most out of the show, we recommend 2 key things. First, check out the extra resources at awesomeatyourjob.com. You can find this episode's transcript and links, as well as the perfect episode for your situation. You can search the full-text transcripts of hundreds of episodes or explore episodes tagged by topic and competency covered. Second, subscribe to the podcast and get future episodes automatically. You can subscribe by telling Siri and several other smartphones and speakers, subscribe to the How to Be Awesome at Your Job podcast, or by tapping subscribe in your podcast player of choice. If you'd like some extra help figuring out podcasts and how subscriptions work, visit awesomeatyourjob.com/subscribe for guidance. Hope to catch you on the next episode of How to Be Awesome at Your Job.